Thank you all for coming to this session. My name is Adam Temashasky. These are my colleagues, Sarah Trembath and Amanda Chowska. We're going to run through a couple of things that are related to this year's Writer's Witness text. We're going to be all right. Part of which is also just a brief overview, if you're not particularly familiar even with the program, which has been going down for 20 plus years, I believe. Just a quick little history about that and what we do with the book, and then how you all might, and this is what we're really interested in. We know how we use it in the Writing Studies program, but you'll all be interacting with first-year students too, who are all going to have read this. What ideas do you have? What might you have in sort of this melting pot of ideas? We can all walk out with even new ways of using the text. So like I said, this is Sarah Trembath. I'm going to turn to her first so you can get a sense of what the book is even referencing in some sections in case the references had be there for you.
Okay, thank you. So may I see a show of hands how many people had heard of Jeff Chang before hearing about this book? Okay, so yeah, you'll hear us in the Writing Studies program say, like, we're really lucky to have gotten him. He's quite a renowned writer, and so we're happy about that. I just wanted to give you a 2-second background on who he is and on some of the things that he's referencing in the book. You might be familiar with them, you might not be, but they seem to be important entryways into discussions with your students. Very quickly, Jeff Chang gained renown as a hip-hop scholar. He's one of the people who really is credited with starting the field. So hip-hop being a young art form, 40 to 45 years old, depending on how you calculate it, is equal, even younger in scholarship. But there are certain books that hip-hop scholars like myself consider classic. Jeff Chang's Can't Stop, Won't Stop is one of them. It was his first book. He won a lot of awards for it. So all of his work is very connected to youth culture. His second book was an edited volume on hip-hop scholarship, and from there he's branched off into sort of new civil rights and race writing, which of course We Gonna Be All Right is one of, but really relies heavily on youth culture. And it is, as Amanda will talk about, it's a book that our students really connected with when they read it over the summer because so many of the referents are already familiar with them. And so I wanted to talk to you about them just to make sure that you're all familiar with them or at least know what to look up on YouTube. Okay. So first of all is the title. I personally think, just as a matter of cross-cultural communication, it's important that we pronounce it correctly. We know that it's an abbreviation of going to, but as you pronounce it, you just say We Gonna Be All Right. It's not like We Gonna Be All Right. So it's really strange pronunciations of it, and I was like, should I mention it? Should I not? But I'm mentioning it because, especially when you have students of color in your classroom, it'll be an instant cue that you've taken the time to pronounce it right. So if you want to pronounce it correctly, just picture the word G-O-N-E, right? We're going to be all right. There's that, okay? You're welcome. I'm glad somebody appreciated that, yeah. Because our staff students this summer are big eyeball rollers. I know they're very skilled in the art of eyeball rolling, and when you mispronounce their slang, you'll get the eyeball roll. Okay?
Sarah, can you tell me what STEP is briefly?
Oh, STEP, yeah. Summer Transition Enrichment Program. Amanda's going to talk about it extensively, but we've taught the book already to a subset of our incoming freshmen. Okay, so one of the things that Jeff Chang does very well, because he's a hip-hop scholar and has been for ages, he uses the vernacular. And he uses the vernacular to signify his in-group connections. In a lot of ways, this book is for people of color. I mean, it's also for a broader audience, but because he doesn't take the time to explain certain reference, he's assuming that you know, or he's challenging you to know, okay? I just thought we could talk about that by looking at the various facets of the cover, right? On the back, if you wouldn't mind turning with me.
Does anyone need a copy? Because we have 3 copies
got a couple left
to give away. Yes.
Sure. On the back, the people that I'm assuming it was him, selected as cover quotes are all people, they're all people of color, and they're all either artists or very connected to the arts community. I suppose that him being who he is, his publishing company, could you help me get back to this guy? His publishing company could have picked anybody, right? But he picked Robin D.G. Kelly, who is a sociologist, I think at UCLA, and is probably one of the other most prominent hip hop scholars, an African American. So he picks two African American cultural activists and scholars, I'm sorry, three, in order to, I think, challenge readers to know who they are, frankly. And so I would take a few minutes to get to know who they are, because one of our students over the summer said, well, how come if he, Amanda will talk about, he's charged sometimes with cultural appropriation because he's not black. But if he's so down with black people, she said, how come he doesn't have any cover quotes? Or how come he doesn't quote black people like Cornel West? And so, well, he does extensively, and she didn't know that. So it's important for us to know his connections to black culture and his prior works. Also, of course, the hands on the front cover. Could you raise your hand if you know what they are?
It's the I forget, I'm blanking on the artist's name who covered Baltimore with images of hands up during the Ferguson.
Okay, so the artist that covered Baltimore with the hands up during Ferguson, but also it's just the chant of the Black Lives Matter movement, right? The Black Lives Matter movement, right? But the hands up is their cue to police officers that they don't have a weapon and they're not going to fight back. And because of the feedback that young African Americans, especially in inner cities, have gotten about doing that when they get pulled over, it became a chant for Black Lives Matter. So in every way, around every turn, Jeff Chang signifies for us that this is who he chooses to be connected with, that he sees himself as a part of the larger community of what he calls people of color, and that he, it's to slip into the vernacular myself, that's who he's down with, okay? Now, his title is probably the most important cue in this way. And it's one that you should be familiar with because your students are. How many of you are familiar with Kendrick Lamar? Okay, that's good. So, Kendrick Lamar's song, We Gonna Be Alright, or I think it's just called Alright, is another chant for the Black Lives Matter movement. And by using the title, Chang is making the connection for us between social activism and social awareness and hip hop. It's his thing, like it's his roots as a scholar, is socially active hip hop. Because he's older, that's what hip hop was when he was writing about it. It's something different now. But Kendrick Lamar is our hope. Our being the hip hop community, he's our hope that hip hop will continue in that socially active vein. Okay? Actually, AU students here hosted a conference about, the whole conference was about this song because it's so important. Harvard University, who is archiving hip hop culture, has chosen Kendrick Lamar as one of the 5 artists that they focus on. The other 4 are old school artists. Kendrick Lamar is really an important artist. And this album, To Pimp a Butterfly, is an autobiographical account of Lamar's life. And he talks in it about the problems that plague his community. He's from Compton, Los Angeles. But he also struggles with depression. And the album is also about how he began as an artist to be co-opted by super profit capitalism and then found his way back to his roots. So it's profoundly, it's very loud in the album. And you need to be at least familiar with this song in order to teach the book, I think. Okay.
What's the contradiction of him as artist?
Please say that again. I didn't quite hear you.
I mean, it's an interesting thing. I mean, the journey of the butterflies, his journey through
Yes.
the contradictions.
Absolutely.
So even in the visual manifestation of one of his rhymes, like the contradiction, like, I mean, yes, this is an artistic statement,
Yep.
but I'm still living present, and it's art.
And it's complex.
And it's complex.
It's one of the reasons why I think Kendrick Lamar gets noticed on so many levels is because he is not a simple artist at all. And so I wouldn't teach this book without showing that video. I'll ask you in a moment what themes you see in it that are echoed in the book. But when when this becomes disturbing, people generally tend to focus on the part, the we hate po-po part, but if you can frame it for your students as part of a whole entire album, this is a midway point for him, but also it's geared at showing the complexities. And I argued when I sat on that panel that I mentioned that this is also a gospel song. And so death is different when it's looked at theologically. And I have a feeling that, he repeatedly references God and Lucy is Lucifer. And so when he talks about we gonna be all right, he says if God got me, he says I'm fucked up, you're fucked up, but if God got us, then we gonna be all right. That's his theology. But what else do you see in there that is mirrored in the book? What can this video help you do when you teach the book? Before I pass it over to Amanda, what is in here that can help you teach the book? I would argue that almost every theme that shows up in the book is in the video. Okay?
Well, I think sometimes you can see LA as sort of the distant city on the hill and the neighborhood where both the joy and the strife takes place. It seems distant and different. And I think that just speaks to the themes of re-segregation.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you, because I meant to mention that, the re-segregation in the subtitle in his book.
What I notice, taking a look at some places, like, with the music you would expect a bass drop, like with the traditional form of the music, and which is sort of the resolution of that, and there isn't that in the video, and there isn't
because
that in the book.
Word.
Yeah, so I think the music part is equally important to the lyrics.
Yeah, critics liken it to jazz.
Yeah.
They situate this as jazz.
Like the absence of resolution.
Okay. What else? What else is in here that can help you shed light on the text for your students?
So there are a lot of images of community too, which especially in the Ferguson chapter, I think comes through the idea of crowds coming together. And there can be, sort of attention in that, but also uplift.
Yeah.
In that too. That those visuals echo in the book also.
Yeah, and the role that art and culture play in that uplift, I think this really comes through with those frames of the singular people dancing in front of all the speakers, that there's all this strife and there's all this, but as Chang had been arguing his whole career, there's always hip hop at the center of that. Okay, so there's a lot to think about in that, and what I would like you to do, if you can start, go ahead.
A snapshot of Michael Brown's community, right? So it's not, so the locality of Compton is lost to me, but over the ubiquity of urban blight, right? So it's like he's giving a snapshot of Michael Brown riding his bike as a youngster and the context of living in the desolation of urban spaces. So it's like this is a physical context across urban America rather than being Compton.
Content specific. Okay, excellent. Mary?
I think anger is also made plainly visible, and that's great. I think as a kind of acknowledgement that it's a legitimate element of the rhetoric of this piece.
Absolutely.
So I have a question about where this does situate in the album then, because this seems like there's, so one of the things the books talk about is the commoditization of diversity or the appropriation of culture, particularly even in higher education as a marketing tool or a branding tool, right? And so it definitely seems like he's going through this transition, or is this the point in the story where he's rejecting, you mentioned in the introduction sort of that he rejected the commercialization of his work or the profiteering off of his work, is that in this video?
I think that he as an artist does that to a degree, but not fully. He's certainly not poor anymore.
The scenes of money being thrown around are not positive scenes, as they are sometimes presented in videos of hip-hop music, right? Sometimes there's the flashing of the money is presented as a success. This did not look like a happy moment.
I think that he shows that as problematic. And this is very much a collaboration, as I say. The videographer is named Colin Foley. He's very famous for his work as well. But I think that Lamar probably is trying to connect with people by showing their culture the way it is, but he certainly calls it into question. It doesn't stop there at the money, right? There's still these problems. We're still getting shot. You're still poor. Like, you know. Yeah, I think he makes it complex for viewers.
I'm curious as to the student group that you worked with this summer and their response to the issues of gender that come up in this
Yes.
in this video. Some of the terminology and the presentation of the female body, for example, and how one might approach that.
Well, that is a perfect segue into Amanda's position.
Great.
Because I was just telling her, like, I'm trying to wrap this up, but yeah, she can probably talk to you at how students responded to the book. I would just close my portion off by saying, please watch this and look at the scholarship on Kendrick Lamar and also on Beyonce's Lemonade. Those both are very important in the book, and they have a lot to teach us about how to teach our students this book. Because they, trust me, as Amanda will tell you, they know these two things by heart.
But I also have a question about teaching this. I have this video on my syllabus, and I'm teaching to international students, so I want to have the lyrics for them, and I'm interested in your perspectives on how I don't want to promote any essentialization of cultures or the ways that we use language. It's part of a rhetorical analysis assignment, so I'm planning on bringing that in. But if you have guidance on how to sort of broach that topic, especially for students who are coming from other parts of the world.
I deal with that in my hip hop class, and you can probably email me and I can send you some things, but I always separate languages when I teach hip hop. It's like there's standard English, there are vernaculars, and I don't ever want to privilege one over the other. It's like if you're in Compton and you're speaking to somebody behind the counter at a grocery store, you might speak this. And if you're a poet, because he certainly uses poetic language in the spoken word, but when he's at Harvard, right, giving his various addresses that he does, he's speaking standard English. And so I break it down for students, and then you can look at, okay, because words, of course, mean opposites in standard English and in vernacular, right, sometimes. So once you define them, then you can say, this is in the vernacular, and what does it mean, that kind of thing. But I would name them and define them first.
Well, thank you.
All right, so I'm going to do some quick background on the Writer's Witness program and how we use the book and stuff. Writer's Witness, it is a first-year community reading program. So all first-year students entering American University ideally will have read the book. The idea behind the program is it should give our students a shared intellectual experience the moment they step into our classrooms and the moment they step into on campus. I like to say to them, I'm hoping that in the first few days of school during move-in, you talk with your dorm mates about, hey, did you read the book? No, I didn't read the book. You have to read the Beyonce chapter. But we want them to have that kind of shared experience from the moment they step into campus. It's also a book that each college writing class will integrate in some way. So you might have students that are taking College Writing 100 or the College Writing Intensive, the 106 course. Ideally, all courses will integrate the book in some way. The books, there's a lot of discussion, especially in recent years, about how the books are chosen. The books are chosen by a committee of writing studies faculty and literature faculty in the previous year. So for instance, probably around October, we'll start talking about what's the book next year. And it's not as simple as Jeff Chang's a hip hop scholar and a rock star, and we'd love to get him on campus. It's more, here are 30 books, and if you have an idea of a book that you would like to nominate for next year, please come talk to one of us later. We'd love to share the nomination form with you. We're always looking for books to nominate for this program. We whittle down that list of 30 books to say 10 books, and then we rank our top 5. And then it comes down to the unfortunate part of logistics. Who's available? Can we afford this person? I had a student several years ago demand to know why Toni Morrison couldn't. There's a couple things here, but I'm going to go with we can't afford her. The book should have high quality of writing, and there should be an element of research, because especially in college writing class, we are concerned with the quality of the writing and how our students are responsibly and ethically integrating research. And we also want to make the research process transparent for them. So I know I was on the committee that chose the
book this year, it was important to me to see how explicitly Chang cited every source in the book and how diligently. And I know in my college writing classes in the fall, I will be focusing on that diligence and requiring them and reminding them even throughout the fall, this is what it should look like. How we use the book in STEP, and what is STEP? STEP is a summer transition enrichment program. It is a scholars program from the Center for Diversity Initiatives. The students are chosen by admissions. One issue that STEP faculty, CDI staff has had for several years, we don't have a lot of say on how the students are chosen for the STEP program. That's just something admissions comes up with this cohort and they hand them over to us. So this year our 46 students in the program, 46 students came to us. They're enrolled in a college writing course. They're also enrolled in another first-year course, so maybe SIS is cross-cultural communications. They might also take a math class. They're also doing programming with the STEP staff and the CDI staff on retention, support, services at American, all of these things that probably most of our first-year students would benefit from, but the STEP students receive an entire 6 weeks of here are these 2 courses, and here are all these other supports that you have available to you at American University. College writing class they take during STEP. It is a pre-college writing class. It is not the same course that they will take in the fall or the spring. It is basically, I like to say, the greatest hits of college writing, and here's sort of how to set yourself up for success, and you will have an edge on your peers in college writing in the fall. We do spend, depending on the summer, 1 to 2 days devoted specifically to the text. We used to teach the text pretty much, okay, get a chapter read by Monday, get a chapter read by Thursday's class, next week read the next chapter, read the next chapter. We now devote usually 2 big days to the book because it gives us more time to play with programming and unpack the book more. We use it as a model of academic writing that integrates research. So the big assignment our students did this summer was a paper where they focused on the they say and the I say, which is using the same language that they use in their composition books. We focus on the rhetoric of the claim instead of the content or the politics of the claim. So examples of how we talk about this, how the writer integrates research. Why did the writer choose that research? How is the writer structuring their argument? Makes sense? This is from the writer's witness page, so if you want to learn more about the program, the goals of it, how it's integrated into the course, I suggest you take a look at this website. Student responses to the text. This year, it was overwhelmingly positive. It was really exciting. They were eager, they were engaged. Students were asking from the first day of class, when do we get to talk about Chang? When do we get to talk about Chang? They were ready. It was cool to read a book about issues I talk about every day. I like getting to read a book for school that reflected my culture. And of course, there is the entire chapter on lemonade, so that was pretty popular. And there's nothing as special as hearing a whole cohort of first-year students saying, hold up, together.
They all know all of the lyrics of the entire album, just so you know. That's why you need to know that.
And we might have had a day where people try to sneak Beyonce lyrics from that album into the lesson. It's pretty fun. It's pretty fun. There's, of course, some criticism and discomfort. A young white guy from my class said during lab, very bravely, / did not think, there was nothing wrong with him saying this, but he said very honestly, he's really biased against white people. He blames white people. So, faculty, we kind of had the moment, and then collected ourselves and had him start to unpack this. Well, what do you mean? Where do you think this is happening? What is going on here? Same student later in the summer. You know that I benefit from white privilege. I have white privilege as a white man. I don't know what to do yet about things I had nothing to do with and I had no say in. So I think about that student and how I think it's a continuum. It is a lot to learn at 18, 19 years old that you have white privilege, especially if you are coming from a community or a school where you may not have talked about that before. I don't think it's any of our jobs to say yes or no, right and wrong, but I think it is our responsibility to give our students tools to work through those moments and think more critically about why they are uncomfortable, why they feel blamed, why they think there's bias in something. There was a big cultural appropriation debate shortly after that student talked about the bias. Is Chang appropriating? Because as some students pointed out, he's not black, but he's using a lot of things from this culture.
Yeah, one of the ways that we reframe that, we, again, like as Amanda said, we never want to tell our students what to think and how to form their opinions. But the conversation about him blaming white people, we went straight to the beginning of the text, and we looked at how he uses the term white people, like, and what's the, why is he so specific about other cultures, and how does it help him position himself as a writer to speak about white people the way he does? So we took it to a rhetorical analysis. With the cultural appropriation debate, that one kind of raged a little bit. A lot of people felt that he was culturally appropriating, and what I wanted to, and this has been part of Jeff Chang's career forever. So we ended up listening to how they felt about it, and then talking about, does Jeff Chang being Asian, does his Asianness define how he should be a scholar? Or did he do the research? Like as Amanda talked, because we teach writing, we are interested in how he used research. And there is research on cultural appropriation. We had students define it and then look in the text to see if he's doing it. And after that conversation, nobody was on that side of the room, I think. I think we broke the room down, it was this room actually, into 3 sections. Yes, he's culturally appropriating. He is, but it's okay, or he's not. And everybody moved over to this side because once they defined cultural appropriation, they stepped back from his Asianness. That's what they saw, an Asian person talking about black stuff. That's what I call it, black stuff. But then when they looked in the text and they saw how researched it was and how he went into the primary source material and secondary source material, they all moved their position.
It's a nice segue where I want to talk about. Some of you may or may not be using the book at all, and so we just want you to know that this book exists. That your students, if you're in the AUX class or you're in a complex problems course, you can expect that they have read it. So these things will be out there, so you're ready for it. I want to show you some of the negative reviews I pulled off Amazon, and I need to put my cards on the table. All I simply did was click on the sort, show me the critical ones. Out of like 27 total reviews, I think these were the 6 or however that were negative. The others were generally quite positive. So I selectively chose these out. But I do think they represent some of the opinions that no matter what course you're in, you might bump into. Especially when something of controversy is on the table. So if Jeff Chang's book comes up in your class, even if you're not teaching it, how might you respond, or what might you even hear? And so this is just an overview of ways that we'll talk about if this shows up, so you're not caught off guard, how can you turn that into a useful moment for you in the classroom? So the first one, I don't know if you can read it far in the back or not. I thought this book lacked empathy for other races. Why are so many in today's culture who were once the victims of racism now allowed to promote race war in this manner? I think it is low and very damaging to both those promoting black and white racism and to the victims of our law enforcement, who are really the ones that lose on this issue. The last 8 years have really forced race relations in the country back to the 60s, right? You don't need to do more than turn on your phone, and you'll find that opinion in some article about Charlottesville and about Confederate monuments. Our students will come in with this. They might surprise you with it. I had a student last year, which I will confess I failed in the moment. Later on, actually, we got a dialogue, and I would say it's a success, but at the moment, I completely failed in class. I teach Ta-Nehisi Coates' The Case Reparations that I have for the last 2 years. It's an amazing piece, and in the course of discussing it, frankly, rarely is there pushback, which I'm always surprised by, but I had a student who said in the middle of class, well, if their neighborhoods are so bad, why don't they just move? And instead of doing what I'm going to talk about next, I began answering the students' questions, which that path you might think could lie success, but actually lied sort of a frictional moment between me and him, whereas if I could have turned it and began thinking about his thinking and used it in class, it would have been a far more successful, I think, for everyone in the moment. the only thing I did, just so you know how badly I failed, I said, well, why do you think no one leaves those neighborhoods? And he goes, well, I don't know. And I was so frustrated that I said, well, that's a fantastic answer. And then we went it's one of those moments where as soon as you leave class, you know, well, I failed as a teacher today. Completely, I failed. Now, just as the nice little epilogue, I emailed that student later and I said, that was an absolutely wrong thing. Once you come to office, I was going to talk about it. So, to his credit, he did. We got into a 2-semester discussion that is frankly ongoing because he keeps coming to my office hours, about Black Lives Matter, which began with him doing the old canard of, well, you know, the same number of whites and blacks are killed every year, so what's the problem? As soon as I point out the stats about proportion, he's like, oh. You know, it's just like, so these little moments can lead somewhere. I just, in the class, I blew it. I completely blew it. So how might you, if we can go to the next slide. The question that we need to be thinking about, no matter what course it is, right? We don't want any students, left, right, middle, any ideological difference or anything, to feel left out. Every classroom should be this encouraging space where a conservative student at AU should be able to feel empowered to raise an issue in class and not have his or her peers mock them, just shut it down. We want dialogue of all sides in there. So how do we do this? How can we actually make room for it? And the answer, ta-da, there is one. Everything that shows up in class can become a means of modeling and reinforcing critical thinking. And so if that, and that's the tough shit, because like me and that student in the moment, as a white guy from Cincinnati, Ohio, who until 2000 was deep asleep, until I moved to DC 17 years ago, and I've been slowly waking up as much as I can. You just want to explain to them, you know, here's why you're wrong. Here's what you're missing. I read, so here's what you're missing. But if you can think about your role, actually, I'm not here as Adam in the classroom. I'm supposed to be facilitating your learning. How can I do that on the fly? So I need to work on critical thinking. Richard Paul, he's the Director of Research and Professional Development at the Center for Critical Thinking, of which there is one. They've got to find this website, by the way. In a talk that he gave, here's one of his, he had many definitions, but here's the definition I thought was useful for us. Critical thinking is thinking that analyzes thought, that assesses thought, and that transforms thought for the better. Now, of course, we can have a whole conversation about what better means, because we're academic people and we can go better in what way. But the key element here that we are trying to use their responses, and they become another text for us. So when a student offers a response, that's actually something that we can now begin to analyze through a few different ways that I just want to use kind of a cheat sheet for. We can pop to the next one. It's centered on the how. You know, and so when I hear my student and he says, well, why don't they just move? Well, if I began thinking about, well, how did you arrive at that? What is it in that thought process that you have? What's your evidence that you have going there? What's your interpretation of evidence that you have going on there? How did you form that argument? If I can use it to break down, and I just mean in an analytical sense, not in a negative sense. If I can break down your argument to see the pieces, well, then I know what actually we need to work on. For instance, I also teach a class on Darwin. And one of the moments in the big book that we read, After Origin of Species, Descent of Man is where he actually says, as you know, that humans evolved from a hominid ancestor. But there's a moment where, a controversial one, he begins saying why men and women have different strengths. And one of his bits of evidence about why women aren't excelling in the intellectual fields, he says, compile a list of the top philosophers, mathematicians, artists in the world. And you'll see that women aren't in those lists. And his evidence, therefore, his conclusion was, aha, that's because they don't excel at those things. So if you actually break that down, his logic from evidence to conclusion is pretty sound. But he didn't examine the flaw of his evidence, which is, why weren't women in those lists? What sort of systemic sexism had kept them out of those fields and attaining that, right? And so once you break it down, the kid's like, oh, well, I can see what part of it needs attention. And so when the student speaks in class, we can break it down into the evidence. You know, this is always the first place that, at least in the writing studies, we tend to point students to, well, how can you see that? You know, and not in a confrontational way, but like, what gives you the means, the grounds to say that? Is that evidence sound? Is it, like, use Darwin, is that a solid bit of evidence? Who's in those lists? You may grant, well, you're right. Those would be the most popular, most successful artists, philosophers, mathematicians. But is that sound? Why is that the evidence? Are there other sound views that they haven't thought of? So if you can, in the classroom, turn your students to, well, what are the other voices on this issue? Why are they sound or not? This idea of validity, again, in our classes, is a huge conversation. And in the United States at large, with fake news, has become an important, in my mind, has become one of the most important things I give my students, is the wherewithal to get a source and examine it. To say, can I trust this? Why or why not? Right? Not just a carte blanche, this one's good, this one's bad, but know how they arrive at trust. It's normally for us, and for my writing studies courses, those are great days of conversation. Well, who do you trust and why? Where do you get your information from? Why is that a strong source? And then people begin disagreeing, naysaying one another's, mixes the pot quite a bit. So the first thing we ask about is evidence. Once we are sort of on the same page as much as we might be able to with evidence, the question becomes, how did you use it? What's the logical bridge? And so if you can break the student's thought process down into that, well, how did you interpret it? I bolded some of the most common fallacies. We teach fallacies. I don't know, some of your classes may bump into them explicitly or implicitly. But of course, there's the ad hominem, where you attack the source of the info as opposed to the info, the argument itself. The post hoc fallacy, which is my personal favorite. That's it happened after this, therefore it happened because of this. The post hoc and the proper hoc fallacy. So students will say, Obama came to power and the stock market did this. Trump came to power, the stock market did this. And they think that that thing caused the other thing. Right? So that is a good example of the post hoc fallacy. And then finally, the hasty generalization fallacy we see all the time, which is students find one bit of evidence. And that is their entire case, right? So that's a hasty generalization. You've made this sweeping claim from this one tiny piece of evidence. And that's one of the things that we'll talk about. This is just a thought I had that you might think about in your own classes, because if you don't use We're Gonna Be All Right, you can still apply this in your own ways, and especially in AUX and complex problems courses, you're coming to complex problems and controversial things. So how might you sort of prime the pump, as it were, to steal a line from Donald Trump, who just invented that phrase, prime the pump. If you can move from the intensely local to the more community level for a student, ask them, whatever text you're going to be discussing that day, whether it's We're Gonna Be All Right, if it's a film, if it's a song, if it's a video, have them think about, what's my reaction to this? And then, if you told your family members how you reacted to the book or the video or whatever text comes up in your class, or even whatever opinion has come up in your class, how would your family members feel about it? Does it fit in with what your family feels? If you went to people you went to high school with, are you in line with them? What about your hometown? Would you fit in with them? And every time, and I wouldn't rush it, but if every time you ask them, well, why is that? Fascinating, but imagine if you're out to drinks with somebody and say, well, oh, you and your family really disagree. Why is that? Well, you've just opened up an hour of some pretty intense conversation probably going to be coming. But instead of me thinking, God, I am right in line with my family, my high school peers, my hometown, why am I exactly like them? Is it possible that my views have been shaped by my environment? Is it just possible? Might it be? And if not, right? And the really interesting conversation becomes, if at any of these moments there's dissonance, well, how that happened, right? The story of people breaking from their family or their community, everyone, it's like in a everyone's different in their own way. How did you break away from that monolithic hold that your family, your town, your schoolmates had on you? And then, now they're here at AU. And this gets them into what's their community like? Is their reaction controversial to their friends at AU? Which is not necessarily their peers at AU, though we'd like everyone to be a peer and a friend. But in case they're different, your friends, your peers, and your professors, and this will help get a light on who do they think they're going to school with, and who do they think they're learning from, and how do they feel that they might fit with them. And so at every stage, the why question becomes the important thing that we want. All right. this meta-thinking, metacognition, it gets them ready to think, well, maybe, I like to think, maybe I'm wrong, or maybe my views have been shaped and they can continue to be shaped. And also, my friends, my peers, my professors, where did their views come from? How have they been shaped and continue to be shaped? And all of that will help students and faculty, right? If we can think about our students' thinking and about our own thinking, then that might be one of the ways forward through the controversial subject.
All right.
Yeah.
So we have some questions for you.
This was one of my questions that I had. What the things I'm really interested in the writing studies program, you know, we have the unique distinction of being sort of left to our own thematic devices, which is to say, we can draw on lots of different things. Like I said, I've taught a class on Evo, I've taught a class on New Yorker, I've done Lincoln Darwin, I'm going to do a class on Ta-Nehisi Coates next semester. And so I'm always looking for, what can I steal from other disciplines? And we've got a room here of people who are across disciplines. And so are there connections to your own classes that you've seen or heard about in the book that just sprung to mind? Resonances, echoes, interesting connections?
Will you be using the book in your classrooms at all? How?
I'm teaching a writing class for international students. It's a precursor to Writing 100. And so this is an experiment to teach this in our program. And already with the title, the we is not a we that my students are going to identify with. So that is going to be the launching discussion for them. And so when I'm reading this book to teach for these students in particular, I'm thinking about in-group, out-group, I'm thinking about rhetoric, but I'm also thinking about vocabulary and grammar and language and how to sort of scale that up to the students. And lots of other things. I love the book. I was interested to hear that there's been a lot of critique across campus because and that made me think that I hadn't read it critically on my own. But in particular, since we have so many Asian students, I think that they're going to enjoy the chapter on Asian Americans.
Yeah, that's a great chapter.
And also in terms of cities, I was really pleased that it has a section about DC because we're trying to get students to engage with the city. And it does create a lot of opportunity to bring art and music in, which is really great for a language classroom.
I'm an SIS, and I'm going to use it in a first-year seminar, which is about U.S. reflections in the mirror, to help the students understand that conflicts today. I'm going to use the two chapters, the vanilla cities and clear chocolate suburbs, and hands up, because one talks about the policies that led to the racial divisions and how it's not accidental, and then the way it helps contextualize the conflict in Ferguson and sort of what happened with it. But I have to say, in reading this, I thought, I think it's great, but I also think this is like way over the heads of a lot of our students. And so I'm struggling with, some ideas I had were to have them pick terms to research the history, or I'm thinking picking quotes and about with different perspectives and using poll everywhere. So have it anonymously to have them respond to which ones they believe. So we get a sense of the different beliefs in the classroom, because I don't want to sugarcoat that. And I also want them to learn to respect the different views. And then I'm also thinking just have them come in with terms and names and ask and set them up in groups and say, start Googling. I won't quote research, which is to learn more, just to get them to understand that when there's something they don't know, like what is re-segregation, what does that mean, or who are all these names that keep coming, or what is a microaggression, or whatever, that they should, or, explore it. And at that point, Googling is fine.
I'm glad you mentioned it being over the heads of some students. That actually surprised me, but that is something that we heard at this step a couple times. Because as heavily versed as Jeff Chang is in youth culture, in this particular book, it's an inroad to a far more complex conversation. And we had a couple of step students say things like, why doesn't he just say what he means? Like, what is all this, you know? And so, yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that because it is not an easy book for all of our students.
Can I ask a question related to that? I know I'm drifting from your question there. So yeah, that's something that actually I was concerned about in reading the book, and especially as you were talking about the youth culture element. Did you find that students felt that because they could easily access the inroad, as you put it, they could easily access the sort of cultural and hip hop elements, that they didn't realize how much they were missing? Because I found it when I read it, I found it to be an intensely difficult book. Not for the youth culture elements, although those were, you know, on the edge of my kind of grasp, but just thinking about the real intellectual substance of the book and the way he makes his arguments he has an interesting arguing style that I think is will be challenging for students. So did you find that students thought they understood more than they actually did because they could grasp the pop culture?
Yes.
They gravitated towards what they grasped.
Yes,
Which
there was
was
a reason
Beyonce.
the Beyonce chapter was so popular. One of my students during that lab went as far to say that he's obscure, so that took a little bit of unpacking.
Like what is obscure.
And what
But I think that
student meant
student
by
is right.
obscure.
He's right. Though,
Yeah.
I think about his arguing style. I mean, the student may not have intended it that way.
Yeah. So we actually kind of pulled back, and we knew that they were already struggling with reading the book because they started reading it, one, like they would read any fictional book that they read in English class in high school. So we did a lot of unpacking, like, one, your writer's witness book is always nonfiction. Two, you can't read books in college like you read novels in high school for college writing or a majority of your other classes. There's an essay from writingspaces.org that many college writing instructors use called Reading Games, which breaks down for students how to read a scholarly article. So another colleague and I designed an activity which basically took reading games and first applied it to Chang's book, and then asked students to, hey, use the Googling and pre-researching skills that you have to choose one of these texts that Chang cites in his book, go find that using the library website, and now apply those same skills, how to decode a scholarly article, to this article. It did help, but they are learning they have to spend more time doing the reading, and they have to be honest about when they are struggling with the reading, which is another thing with STEP. We try to dispel, like, it is okay to ask for support, and it is okay to ask for help, and many of them are still getting over that hump of, if I ask for help or support or I go to office hours, it doesn't mean that I don't get it or I don't deserve to be here or any number of things. It means that this is what I need to go get support on.
What was the website you mentioned?
If you Google reading games, Karen Rosenberg, and writingspaces.org, it should pop up.
Yeah, there's a whole site. It's Writing Spaces, one word. It's a collection of open access articles on writing that are written for students. And Reading Games is one that a lot of us use. There's a number of them. It really is a fabulous resource, and students, they're quick and easy reads. You know, if you had something in your class that you wanted to address with students, you can assign them a chapter out of that because they're extraordinarily accessible. And they're written by experts in the field of composition for students. So it's a really great resource.
For instance, one of the essays that I use, I think it was called "Annoying Ways Students Use Resources," and like it gives you the idea of the attitude they put, which is very informal, but the like 15 things that he walks through, he explains, and like, yeah, this annoys me. He's right. That language is annoying when you do things like this. So yeah, there's many great things. To that, if we could, in the interest of time, so this is something that I'm particularly interested in also. Like I said, I teach the case for reparations, which I recommend to every single person, especially if you're American. That and another book that we considered, but we couldn't get her, was Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, which, again, should be required reading for anyone who gets the vote. But those two texts, again and again, in my margins, I would write like Alexander or Coates, because they were touchstones coming up again and again and again. And so it got me wondering, what text for you did Chang sort of inspire, like, oh, this reminds me of whatever, or like a song, a movie, an academic text, anything, with any kind of media that came up for you as you read it?
They Can't Kill Us All by Wesley Lowery. Certainly, I mean, he goes in depth into Ferguson, so the chapter and subchapter here, definitely a correlation there.
They Can't Kill Us All.
Yeah.
Great.
Yep.
There's, I thought about using, I think he's a faculty here who just published Cappuccino City. Derek Hines, I think he's an SBA. Ira. But then I abandoned that to put more of the writing spaces stuff since it's a writing course. But there's a lot of great stuff on Beyonce's Lemonade about that are both videos and articles. So I have one that's called How Beyonce Perfected the Visual Album Lemonade, and that's a video. And there's an article that I found called What Beyonce Teaches Us About the African Diaspora in Lemonade. So I mean, I hope students read those when they're reading them. Read or engage with those.
Great.
One book that came up again in my mind when I read it was Having Their Say. Has anyone ever heard of that? It's a fantastic book. I was required reading for an American history class that I took in the UK about the segregation in Jim Crow time in America. And it's called Having Their Say. It's a very accessible book. It's about these two women who were born in the 1880s. They're sisters.
Oh, yeah.
And they lived to be like 100 and something years old. And so someone's interviewing them in the 70s, talking about their time growing up before Jim Crow and then after, and they could remember the difference. And it's just their lifetime when they became a dentist and a doctor, and they were very successful women, and they never got married, and they lived together until they died in the 70s. And it was amazing. And it just opened my eyes, because like this is about re-segregation, but that was about the original segregation. And it was like, because one of the questions in the class was segregation a natural consequence of the Civil War? And you know, I was like, well, yeah, of course it was. But then you look at all these things and how it was institutionalized and policies came up decades after the Civil War was over. And so like how it was kind of created, and for me as like a 19-year-old American in the UK, it was very eye-opening. And Having Their Say, I mean, you could read it in like a night. It's very quick, and it's really real, the voices that they give. Their voices came through really well, so I liked it a lot. And I thought I was thinking about it a lot.
So another book so I work in the Office of Campus Life, and I'm not a professor and I'm not teaching this to students, but we in Campus Life as a staff are reading the book together so we can best support students. And another book that we were going to use to follow up with this one is Disintegration, which is Eugene Robinson's text, and it talks a lot about the white flight and resegregation pieces, talking geographically around Black meccas. And it also talks about the disintegration of Black culture as one monolithic thing, and it breaks down the different subsets of what we mean by Black people or Black culture and what were the touch points where those diversions happen. So he has like 4 categories of Black people that he talks about. He talks about why and what are the geographic references for each of those groups. And so I think that's really helpful if we're thinking on a college campus about talking about a population of Black students, and our Black students are not all the same. And they come from a lot of different things with a lot of different experiences, and they may fit into many different categories. And so we find that a lot with student organizations and how different Black organizations on campus work together, or how different organizations focused on multicultural identities work together, and things like that. So Disintegration by Eugene Robinson, who's the Washington Post writer, is a good follow on for us.
Yeah, for contrast, I thought made me think about particularly the chapter on cultural equity about Kwame Apana's cosmopolitanism, and differing views about like that culture is not static. It's sort of like opposing against that.
Yeah, for the same chapter, I found this great online resource from the National Endowment for the Arts on it's from November 2016, and it features 5 artists from very diverse backgrounds talking about inclusion and exclusion in government-funded arts initiatives. And for the chapter on universities, I was hoping to show videos and articles, use articles about what happened on campus last year with interviews. I think Taylor Dumpson has some interviews online video interviews. So working into the chapter on universities, what happened at AU last year.
Can I suggest one? Yeah, one of the ways that I teach books that have to do with race is I always find a counter narrative. And the book I'll be teaching alongside of this book is called Strangers in Their Own Land. Have you guys read it?
Yeah.
It is so good. Did you love it?
Yes.
Yeah, so Arlie Russell Hochschild, she is a sociologist from the University of California, Berkeley. And she went to the Chemical Belt in Louisiana to study why people who you would think would vote Democrat vote Tea Party. So she went into very conservative working class. It is so timely for right now. And her method is certainly very scientifically sound, but it's also based on empathy. She speaks about empathy walls to understanding people who are different than you, and for the name calling that's going on between the so-called liberals and the so-called conservatives, it is an excellent book. She comes up with some very, the reason I chose it is because of whatever's problematic about Chang's first chapter, the way that he speaks of white people is for his own purpose, to situate himself among people of color. But it is off-putting, I think, to certainly the white students who are sensitive in that way. But this book really looks at why some of the more conservative opinions arising out of these communities, they make much more sense than we like to think when we just want to label them as crazy or stupid or whatever. So I'll be teaching Strangers in Their Own Land along with this book.
That is just a kind of follow-up question, a couple of follow-up questions to what you were saying just now. How do you avoid falling into false equivalence, like in the need to understand and accommodate people's discomfort or anxiety about certain things that are being said? What are some ways in which you can not fall into false equivalence and revert to making sure conservative or white young students like the one that was quoted are comfortable as opposed to addressing the larger issue being discussed, which is something I think as a nation we're struggling with.
Absolutely.
But I myself struggle with that specifically in classrooms. So how do you?
That's a great question. I am not there to teach the topics, really. I mean, the topics are certainly what we're discussing. It's a little bit easier for us because we're focused on the writer's craft. And so it's always easy for me to sort of divert difficult conversations into, I think this is one of Adam's slides, into like, well, how did the author construct this argument? Like what's the evidence that he's using? But to me, what I rely most heavily on in almost all of my teaching is the body of work that Adam referenced, the critical thinking. I am always geared. As a teacher, I don't care what people's political opinions are. I am very opinionated myself, but I'm clear that that's not why I'm here. I am here to develop thinkers. And so thinkers have to question their sources. They have to look at other sources. That it's finding balancing sources is part of being a critical thinker. I focus, and it helps me as a person because I don't like hearing some of the opinions that I hear in class. I got a paper last year that my department is aware of on why Hitler really wasn't that bad. That kills me. It's really hard to read, But I know that if I go into it like, this is wrong, are you crazy? I will lose that child, right? Both that student, both as a thinker and a writer, and maybe even to that camp, right? So to me, it's about sitting down with him and saying, but your whole paper doesn't include any mention of the Holocaust victims, right? So let's see how we can, work these things. I have to look at sources. I have to look at arguments. I have to gear it towards critical thinking.
Sorry, a couple of follow-up questions. So I teach a lot of international students as well, and I was wondering also about the politics of language. In maybe some class discussions that can come up when you show the video or you give them the lyrics, for example, there are a lot of, the problem is not that they're curse words, but that they're all specifically associated with certain races or things like that. And so I was wondering about how to navigate, for example, if a student in class, an African-American student uses the N-word
and then if a student who's not African American uses the N-word, or maybe because maybe they're an international student and they don't know, in which case it's easier. You say, look, that's not, but also kind of how to navigate language stuff that can come up. And the last one, just going back about the gender question, which I think in the video and in the book less so, but I think it is an issue in the video, and I was wondering if it came up at all, and if it did, how did you address it?
The vernacular I always handle as cross-cultural communication. I label it that, I let them know it's okay to struggle with it, and we look at who speaks it, that you can have help interpret you. As far as the N-word, because I teach a hip-hop scholarship class, that comes up, and what I do at the beginning, what I learned to do at the beginning of every semester is to just put it out there as a question. I let students write for me on it, and the question I ask them is, should we use it in class? And I never get people who say yes. I always, my whole class, I let them write on it so that I'm sure I'm getting their opinion and not the group's opinion. And what they always tell me is it's okay for people of color to use it, it's not okay for white people to use it. And so we will use it when we're quoting people who are saying it, but we won't use it. They come up with that. But I put it out there as an issue to begin with.
I'd also say we have some possible syllabus language you can borrow, steal, adapt, etc. You have the right to disagree with each other, initiate debate. This must be done in a respectful, classroom-appropriate manner according to the American University Student Conduct Code. Focus on applying your critical reasoning skills and practicing rhetorical moves to our discussions and avoid personal attacks on a classmate instead of arguing an issue. I also asked them to read a Michiko Kakutani article, which is now somewhat dated, and it's from 2002. But the students are surprised when they read it because Kakutani is basically arguing that people are not arguing in the classroom. And I have them reading the first few days of school, and then I say, okay, so let's start to look at some other popular conversations online about this. What are people saying now? The rhetoric and the conversation on students arguing in the classroom is very different in 2017 than it was in 2002. And they say, well, which is the right answer? I'm like, I need you to go somewhere in between. Like, we need to promote this academic civil discourse where you will disagree with people, and you'll disagree with evidence, and you'll disagree with reasoning, instead of disagreeing with the person or their personal beliefs or their cultural beliefs or their personal background to that extent.
And that you can argue, the rule that I set in my classroom is that you're arguing the topic, you're not arguing with the student. But we got the wrap up thing. So one thing that you guys might want to check out is from the CTRL. We have a beautiful live document promoting civil discourse in troubling times, it's called, and I link it to my syllabi. And it gives, very quickly, students can ask questions. These are guidelines that guide civil discourse in their classroom. Students can ask questions without fear of ridicule. Faculty encourage students to brainstorm new approaches to new problems without imposing their opinions. Faculty and students are likely sensitive to, they have their own biases, but they don't impose them on each other. They're encouraged to allow space for all voices. So these guidelines, there are many of them, are perfect for like the first day of class. And then when people are in violation, instead of being like, you really shouldn't talk that way because it's not okay, you can be like, remember the guidelines that we went over? Let's see how we can bring this conversation back in line with those. So.
I just wanted to offer that the Peace Studies program in the School for International Service also puts out a really nice handout that distinguishes between debate, discussion, and dialogue, and shows the differences there. And when employed, when utilized, it really does take people to deeper levels of understanding. It's a journey of exploration rather than trying to prove you're right. And it goes beyond just discussion.
Is that available on their webpage?
I'm not sure if it's on the website, but I will get that to all of you.
Great. And since we have to wrap up, just as a reminder, if there's anything that's been mentioned that you want a copy of or want us to direct you to, scholarship, book that we mentioned, anything, please email any of us. We will be delighted to flood you with resources. Yeah.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you very much for being
Thank
here.